A lot of people don't want to hear this, but I believe there needs to be a revolution of some kind. And maybe that's when Bitcoin has its moment.
Do you ever feel like the United States is in that situation right now, that we are overexpanded?
If we look at major media outlets, they've been adversarial.
It was just a fairer, more balanced system. If we go back to a sound money standard, we really believe that Bitcoin is the way out of this thing.
Be careful what you wish for, because in a regulatory framework, you're inviting all sorts of mischief.
We'll even use Reagan's words, right? Government is the problem. Well, let's get them the hell out of money.
On its way to becoming truly the money supply or the monetary system, it has to.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Bitcoin Boomers. I'm Bob Burnett. I'm here with my co-hosts, Gary Leland and Lawrence Lepard. And today we have a special guest named John Heubusch. John is an old friend of mine. We worked together back about 30 years ago while I was at Gateway, and have kept in touch since we both went into other pastures. In our first episode of this series, we had a gentleman by the name of George Bodine, and we introduced him as potentially the most interesting man in the world. But I do think we have another candidate here. John, and we'll go into the details of his history, but John has had a varied and illustrious career in politics, in business, in writing, in philanthropy. We're going to dig into a whole bunch of it, but welcome, John. I'm so glad you could join us.
Hey, great to be with you, Bob, Lawrence, and Gary.
So, John, I think, I alluded to some of the various hats you've worn kind of in your life. And I'm being serious, by the way, not in jest, that you've led a tremendously interesting life. I think a lot of us have been blessed to have done so, but you've touched a lot of lives and seen a lot of things. You and I having a personal relationship, I know some things that maybe some others wouldn't know. But I thought, just to kind of maybe get people acclimated and introduced to you, we could talk about a few of the things that you've seen in your life. And one of the things I've always found really interesting is you had the opportunity to have dinner with Lady Di.
I actually had a date with Lady Di.
Oh, well, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, let's upgrade this a little bit.
Yes. I'm sorry to shortchange you, John.
That's okay.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how you came to have a date with Lady Di, and any observations you might have about her.
No, so I started my career as a young man working in the Pentagon, and that's a little job, almost a nothing job, but moved on to Capitol Hill. And so I was in politics for the first part of my career, and jumped from Capitol Hill, this is during the Reagan presidency, and became Elizabeth Dole's chief of staff when she was Secretary of Labor for President George H.W. Bush. And when I was chief of staff at Labor for 2 years, then jumped over to the American Red Cross, of all places, because Elizabeth was the first cabinet secretary to leave the Bush administration, make the jump, and she asked me to come over with her. And I told her at the time, the only thing I know about the Red Cross, Elizabeth, is they taught me how to swim, I think. So I was the number 3, then the number 2 under Elizabeth at Red Cross. And she's an incredibly bright Harvard-trained lawyer and incredible personality, hugely smart. She did so many things while at the Red Cross. One of them was she struck up a friendship with Lady Diana, who at the time was the British ambassador for the Red Cross worldwide. And Diana was, as you might remember from that time, was all about landmines and removing landmines from war-torn nations. And she came over to visit the United States at a time when I had just made the move from running this big national party committee to Gateway Computers, in fact. And so, Bob, I know you well recall our good friend and CEO, Ted Waite. So I was only on the job at Gateway for a couple of months, and I was in Ted's office, and phone rang. And actually, Ted's secretary came in and said, John, there's a call for you. And I was in this intense discussion with Ted. So I'm like, I'll just tell whoever it is, I'll call him back. So then she comes back and goes, no, they really insist you take the call. And I started feeling bad because I'm like, Ted's going to get mad here. What is this? So I said, look, I don't care who it is. I'm in a meeting. She comes back a third time and she opens the door. Ted says, just take the stupid call. So I pick up the phone and there's nobody on the line, but there's a recording and it's Frank Sinatra singing Happy Birthday. And when it gets to Happy Birthday, I hear Elizabeth's voice, which she says, John. And at the end of the recording, it's another recording from Elizabeth, which says, just wanted to wish you happy birthday. And as a birthday present, I'd like to know if you'd like to go on a date with Lady Diana. Well, yeah, Ted, this meeting's over. And I flew back, and for my birthday, she and Bob Dole, her husband, were entertaining Diana, who was on a visit to D.C. for the Red Cross purposes. And we all went out for a dinner and a date, and it just blew my mind. Because I at the time, I don't know how many American males, I was single at the time, were in love with Lady Diana, but I sure was.
That's fabulous. So that would have been like what, me, John, like 98, 97, 98?
Yeah, 97. It was 97.
Now John has a lovely wife. Her name's Marcella. He did very well.
Yeah, don't tell her this Lady Di story either. She would not like that.
So life was very kind, and she's a wonderful woman. I'm sure the right thing happened. But imagine how different history might be had this gone a different direction. Wow.
No, and I one of the most, I don't know, pretty tough moments is I wasn't that much further. I don't know, maybe it was 6 or 8 months. I won't get the dates right. But then she dies crashing in that tunnel in Paris. It was like, oh, when that kind of thing happens, and you just relatively recently have been with her, was really striking.
Yeah.
But yeah, my jobs, the first half of my life was just pure politics and nonprofit. And then I literally remember when I was chief of staff at labor, I was meeting with all these major business figures, the CEO of McDonald's and all the rest. And I sat there during the conversation with one of them thinking, you know what, this is interesting. I don't know the first thing about business. Not that first, I knew politics and all the rest, but it was just this huge hole in my resume. I had all these job offers to be a lobbyist in D.C., but Gateway called me. And I thought, what is this? Who's that? Well, they're this little computer startup in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa. And I said, I got to check this out. And that's how I got introduced to the tech space and business, and, the rest is history.
I think it's really cool, John. I don't know that I've ever heard you say what you just said, which was that you had that realization that you didn't understand and didn't have this experience in the business side. And I think that's one of the huge problems with the political base today is, I do have to interface in my current role with lots of people in Washington, and it is shocking how little business acumen they have, how little understanding of the way business really works, and yet they're creating the regulations, they're creating the laws, and it's scary as shit.
Yeah, you bet it is. And to some extent, Bob, that's in part a matter of age. And I say that because, when I was 25 years old as a legislative director working on Capitol Hill, I succeeded in killing a defense platform, a weapons system, put tens of thousands of people out of business, $5 billion, went away. When you're those jobs at a very young age, you get placed with an enormous amount of responsibility, and you don't even barely understand the world right near you, much less, everything around you. And so there's at a young age, you have a lot of power, but not a lot of knowledge. And, of course, you gain knowledge as you move forward, but so much of our, many of the people that have exceeded to the highest level in politics have never worked a day in their life outside of public office. And, they take tours of business, but they don't understand them, so it's a real flaw in our system. I'm not sure how to fix it. I definitely support term limits, because if we could, there's just too much power concentration and people wanting to spend their career in Washington rather than, actually go out and be a real person somewhere.
Well, John, since you've been in that field, I guess, do you think that's ever going to be possible to get term limits since they have to vote on like cutting their careers out?
Well, I'll put it this way. See, I've always been right of center on the conservative end of the political spectrum. And I've worked for members of Congress and in administrations where if we could cut federal government spending in half, I'm in. How do we get there, right? And because it's the national debt and what it has done to this nation, the whole monetary system, everything, it is so extremely flawed. And the problem is, if you're an average member of Congress or the Senate, there's nothing in it for you to cut spending. I mean, it puts you in trouble during election time. And so they accumulate this power by continuing to give it away, spend beyond our means. And so now we've got a $37 trillion national debt. I think term limits come around when this nation ends up upside down into some kind of a revolution where people have just frankly had enough. I mean, do I see that day in the near term? No, but that is definitely where we're heading. We are heading off a cliff, a fiscal cliff, and it's because there's no discipline in the system.
Well, I don't think there's anyone here who disagrees with you.
Yeah, that's a fourth part. I mean, we got to reset it. John, I'm curious. I was doing the research on your background, and I noticed a strong connection to Reagan, who I admire, and to Nancy Reagan as well. Can you kind of walk us through some of that? Just because I'd love to hear the firsthand stories of the two of them. Do you know what I mean? You must have seen things that the three of us would never have seen,
Yeah, sure. Well, first, while I've been to the White House hundreds of times, I never worked directly for Ronald Reagan. I met him many times. I was in meetings with him, and I worked a lot for Mrs. Reagan. But on Capitol Hill, the congressman I worked for, he got swept in on Reagan's coattails in 1980, just like many others did. And we had this fairly liberal district, which was not easy to get reelected in.
Where was it? What state was it from?
5th District of Oregon. So that Portland suburbs down through Salem, the Willamette Valley, that whole area. And so to be pro-Reagan and pro-Reagan economics at the time, and Reagan was all about less taxes, less regulation, cut federal spending, and strong defense. That wasn't what Oregon wanted, that was for sure. So my first day on the job as a young kid on Capitol Hill, I got to run across the street and watch Reagan hold up his hand, take the oath of office. And then my last day on Capitol Hill, I got invited down to the White House, shake his hand, and watch him get on the helicopter, and he circled the city a couple of times before he went back west. But I had been engaged in many, many issues that Reagan was involved in. So having been around him on the legislative side, I got to know him, Mrs. Reagan. And so then I went off in my career thinking, well, that's probably the end of my Reagan connection. But after I left Gateway and did some other things, Mrs. Reagan called me and said, hey, John, would you consider running the Reagan Library? And I was living in La Jolla at the time. And I thought first, I was with my son. We were in a toy store. He's like 5 years old, screaming. And, hi, John, this is Nancy Reagan. And I said, yeah, right. Then there was silence. So then I thought, this might really be, it's kind of sounded like her. So then she said, no, I'd like you to consider moving up to LA. I was living in La Jolla. I thought, oh, God. I said, well, Mrs. Reagan, can I ask you one question? Yeah. Would you consider moving the Reagan Library to La Jolla? I just didn't want to move. And she said, no. Okay. 6 months later, there I was moving to LA and running the Reagan Library. So, and when you run the Reagan Library, between Mrs. Reagan and everybody and anybody that ever worked for him, they go through there. And I mean, it's just a Reagan fest, So I spent 13 years doing that. And that's where some of these stories come in, like you were talking before we went on air about finding a vial of Reagan's blood. I mean, that was kind of a unique situation, and I fought my tail off to make sure we fixed that, and we did, but it took a lot of effort.
Yeah, John, tell that story.
When Hinckley attempted to assassinate him in Washington, D.C., outside the hotel, Reagan didn't know he was shot. He got shoved in the limousine, and he thought he might have the Secret Service agent might have broken a rib when he pushed him in, and he just said, let's get back to the White House. And then the Secret Service agent noticed that blood was starting to form on his lips, and he said, bullshit, we're going straight to GW Hospital. And they went into the hospital, and so when they pulled the bullet out of him, and he had lost, believe this or not, he had lost 1/2 of his blood by the time they got him to the waiting table. Yeah. So there was plenty of blood to go around. There was a vial of blood that they took for testing purposes to determine what he had in his system and that sort of thing. And that blood got put in a storage facility, and over the years kind of got forgotten. And then a nurse found it and stole it and took it home. And she passed away, and then her son found it, and her son decides he wants to sell it on eBay. This was not a good situation. Mrs. Reagan called me and said, have you read this story about Ronnie's blood? And I said, yeah. She said, you're going to go get it. and we had, I mean, lots of lawyers, lots of threats, we came after them. And they voluntarily gave it up. They got so scared of what might occur. And so that blood now sits in the safe that's in my old office at the Reagan Library. It just would have been ridiculous. You can't let something like that happen.
So did they give it up like no problems? They just say, oh, here's the blood? Or did it take
took about a week of lawyers with big, sharp fangs,
By the way, if you're out there, you've never been to the Reagan Library, it's a phenomenal facility. The work that John did to build it, I've had the pleasure of going there and getting a tour from John and kind of going even into some rooms and things that maybe not everybody gets to go to, and just absolutely fascinating. And whether you're a fan of Reagan or not, I happen to be, but whether you're a fan or not, it's a major part of American history. And it's just hard not to even walk through those halls and not kind of just feel the vibe, and it must have been pretty cool to go there every day, John.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and the thing is, when you hear the word library, you just think some big place with a lot of books on the shelves. It's just so much more than that. It's an enormous museum. There's, you can climb aboard Air Force One.
And Air Force One is inside the museum.
Yeah. You guys remember Boone Pickens?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Boone wrote a $50 million check to put a big glass case around Air Force One so that the library could accept the plane from the Air Force.
How did they get it there? I never asked that question.
So its last flight was out to an Air Force base here in California. They took the wings off. They took off the tail. They flew it in pieces. They had to shut down I-5. And, it was really something. But, it took about a year to reassemble. And it now, if you just charge up the batteries and put gas in it, you can fly it away. It was restored by GE and Boeing to flying condition. The great thing about this conversation is we haven't talked a lot about economics, because I was thinking I was going to tell you guys, I know you all know economics backwards, forwards, but I'm thinking about starting a GoFundMe campaign for me to make up for my lack of knowledge in economics. So if you guys would be interested in contributing to that.
You need to make that for Bitcoin.
In your reading list, if you probably read 10 books, you'll be 80% of where you need to be. I mean, The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffith. You know that book?
Nope.
I don't know how much Bob told you about us, but as you know, we're all Bitcoiners, and our belief and my belief, and I think Bob's and Gary's too, is that really the monetary system is what's led to the broken nature of our country today. That the system is set up to benefit. The politicians and the banks and the Federal Reserve are all kind of a cabal, and they got together, and they rigged the system in their favor, and that's why we have the wealth inequality, and that's why we have 30% interest rates, and it's really why America is not, the America that we all grew up in. I don't know where you grew up, John. Where did you grow up? What area of the country were you in?
McLean, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I think Bob grew up in Wisconsin. I'm not sure. Gary, where did you grow up?
Charleston, South Carolina.
As we all recall, there was really a vibrant middle class when we were growing up. My dad was a shopkeeper, and the guy who ran Ford lived down the street from us, and he probably made 4 or 5 times what my dad made, but he didn't make 400 times what my dad made. You know what I mean? And it was just, it was just a fairer, more balanced system. Probably the biggest crime of our lives that I know I remember, and you probably do too, you're probably similar ages, was Nixon going off the gold standard in 71. That was a really, really bad thing. When we abandoned sound money in 1971, that was the beginning of the end. Now, we had enough institutional momentum because, in 46, we stood at the top of the world having won World War II, that, and all the other countries were destroyed. So that, we coasted on that momentum for a long, long, long time. But, the rot and the creep just came in, and pretty soon, you had Cheney saying deficits don't matter, and you had politicians saying, we got to go make the Middle East safe so we can grab all their oil. And the next thing you know, you've spent $8 trillion and maimed a lot of people. And, it's all friggin' tragic. It's absolutely tragic. And, I know that in my case, I think really in all 3 of our cases, we're all working and supporting Bitcoin because we really believe that Bitcoin is the way out of this thing. If we go back to a sound money standard, and that could involve gold, by the way, too. Gold is, the way we like to look at it is gold is analog sound money, and Bitcoin is digital sound money. And both of them have the advantage of being distinct from the government. And the reason the government has gotten away with all this stuff and it's become so out of control, as you alluded to earlier, is that they can print money into existence. And so the temptation to do that is so large, and they do it, and that keeps them in power. And the cost, they don't see the cost, but the cost is the working class man or woman who goes to the grocery store and suddenly ground beef is $9 instead of $2, because of all the inflation. So it's really problematic,
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I remember I was on the budget committee staff in Congress, and at the time, the federal budget deficit was nearing this all-time high of several hundred billion, and the national debt was not yet 1 trillion.
Right.
But we could eyeball it and see in 3 or 4 years, if the spending kept on the path it was going to be 1 trillion, and that just was a mind blower, right? And now you think about where we are today, it's absurd. And
of course it is. Yeah, I in the book I go through that. I remember how everyone was down on Reagan for the deficits and just how irresponsible the Reagan deficits were, and they were 100, 200, billion dollars, and that was quaint by comparison. And one could even argue, and he also got a lot of real GDP growth. There were a few years in there where we grew 4, 5, 6% a year as a result of that, and that's what led to the failure of the Soviet Union. So one could actually make an argument that it did make sense to deficit spend there. The problem is, guys like Dick Cheney and other guys picked up on it and said, "Hey, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter."
Now, yeah, in fact, if you look back at the Reagan years, just like you said, people say, "Well, he didn't cut the deficit." No, but he did something that was unprecedented at the time. He cut the rate of growth of federal spending. That was the best you could do, right? Because Reagan never owned the Congress. He had Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives all 8 years of his presidency.
I've forgotten that. Yeah.
Well, go back to the fundamental of all fundamentals, and that is it would just get a true balanced budget act passed. But now we're so far off the cliff. To balance the federal budget, it would take Bitcoin-sized value and in remarkable, we'd have to cut half of the federal budget as it exists today.
One of the good macro analysts that we follow says you basically have to cut Social Security, Medicare, and defense spending by 50% for the next 15 years. Good luck with that.
Yeah, well, here's another one. In 2 years, our interest payment on the debt alone is going to exceed all the money we spend on all discretionary programs and all of our defense budget. And then by 2050, interest on the debt alone will exceed the entire federal budget.
We won't make it without a collapse. Yeah.
Blockstream Jade is your easy-to-use, Bitcoin-only cold storage solution made for both experts and beginners alike. Its simple, clean interface makes it a great gift to friends and family just starting down their Bitcoin journey. The open-source hardware of the Jade combined with the open-source software of the Blockstream app means full transparency. Like Bitcoin itself, you never have to trust and can always verify. And at an affordable price, the Blockstream Jade allows you to safeguard your future without breaking the bank. Buy 2, 3, or 4 Jade Classics together and get up to 25% off this holiday season. Plus, get 10% off any Jade with the code BOOMERS. Open source, transparent, Bitcoin only. Blockstream. Peace of mind without compromise. The more your Bitcoin holdings grow, the more complex your challenges become. What started as simple self-custody now involves family legacy planning, sophisticated security decisions, and navigating situations where a single mistake could cost generations of wealth. Standard services weren't built for these high-stakes realities. That's why long-term investors choose Unchained Signature, a premium private client service for serious Bitcoin holders who want expert guidance, resilient custody, and an enduring partnership. With Signature, you're paired with your own dedicated account manager, someone who understands your goals and helps you every step of the way. You get white-glove onboarding, same-day emergency support, personalized education, reduced trading fees, and priority access to exclusive events and features. And Unchained's collaborative custody model is designed to provide the same security posture as the world's biggest Bitcoin custodians, but for those who prefer to hold their own keys. Learn more about Unchained Signature at unchained.com/BTC Boomers. Use code BOOMERS10 at checkout to get 10% off your first year. Because Bitcoin isn't just for life, it's for generations.
I think this review of kind of where we were in the Reagan era and comparisons where we are now is really important, because I think a lot of younger people and even older people probably have no concept as like, how did we get here? And Larry, for us in the kind of coming from the Bitcoin world and that have really kind of dug into economics, 71 was a big deal. Like the Nixon removal of us from the gold standard.
But that was a temporary removal, Bob. That was temporary.
Yeah, he's temporarily suspending the redemption of dollars for gold was how it was categorized or how he stated. But I think what's interesting about Reagan, since we're kind of focused there, was that happened in 71. Then by the late 70s, we have the Carter administration, we have inflation running out of control. It kind of was the foreshadow of kind of what was going to happen, like this chaos, because now the relationship of really all responsibility was gone, and accountability. There's a guy in the Bitcoin world that his name's Jack Mallers, is a young guy, kind of one of the guys I think that a lot of us find promising about the future. I don't know, he's maybe in his early 30s, but he has this phrase that I give him a lot of credit for, and he says, "No man should have to work for what another man can print." And I think it's a wonderful way of categorizing it. And what we've done in this case, the man is the government. So, at that point, fiscal responsibility became completely, it really didn't matter anymore, right? I mean, to a certain degree, tax revenue didn't even matter, that they could print whatever they wanted. And the US has this not strange, but very preferred position too, that because the rest of the world is dependent on the dollar, it's the reserve currency we kind of export inflation. So when we grow the money supply, we feel it, but but about 80% of the impact of that growth is actually felt outside our borders, not inside, which I find kind of immoral and unethical that, that be the case. How do you think, John, if Reagan, ask you to go inside Reagan's head for a minute here. So if Reagan was president right now and he was looking at this situation, how do you think he would react to 38 trillion and at least the fiscal side of this?
Yeah, well, okay, so let's wind the clock back first. When Reagan came into office, post-Carter, as you say, inflation was 13.5%. Interest rates were 20%. Marginal tax rates were 70%. I mean, this, I don't, thank God I wasn't working at the time. I was in college or something. What did I care? But when Reagan came in office and these kinds of conditions existed, I don't know how people made it. So 2 years later, Reagan lost 26 Republican seats in the House and a few seats in the Senate. And why is that? I remember at the time, the mantra was on the Republican side, Reagan was saying, stay the course, fiscal discipline, all that stuff. And the Republicans in Congress were saying, yeah, stay the course, meaning the pain was so great they all thought they were going to lose because they started voting against this federal spending and what have you. And Reagan did lose 26 seats. There's a price to be paid by being fiscally disciplined, right? It's why you see this to this very day, even Republicans are jumping ship, Trump ship for certain things because they're just trying to preserve their power or basically preserve their seat in Congress. So I have, I watched the phenomena of Trump in the mid 2015s, and I'm now fully convinced myself. What Trump does is he wakes up in the morning, he goes under the bed, he grabs this binder and it's the Reagan playbook. I mean, if you think about what Reagan stood for, Trump's trying to do many of those things: a strong national defense, lower taxes, and from a monetary policy standpoint, as you all know, I mean, he's probably the first and only president that has been pro-crypto, pro-Bitcoin. He thinks like a fiscal conservative. Now, does he have the ability to pull it off in the modern day, especially with the complexion of Congress like it is? Whole nother question. I mean, it's now almost like it's become Mount Everest, and not many people have got enough oxygen to make it up there on their own. So I now put in a hypothetical, put Reagan in charge. First, he'd fall over dead at the size of the debt. I mean, and he would be urging us to cut spending like you can't believe. He'd also be, pushing for, supply side style tax cuts and the rest. But I genuinely think we're beyond the day when those things can work. I mean, I really do believe that. I mean, a lot of people don't want to hear this, but I believe there needs to be a revolution of some kind because the situation gets so bad that there's no choice but for everything to be turned upside down. And maybe that's when there's, Bitcoin has its moment. Until then, Bob, I'm trying to do, it's not as though Bitcoin doesn't make perfect sense like gold does. However, my view, I'm trying to understand, how do you get there from here with every vested interest, every economic interest in the United States based in the current system? I don't think it's just going to take a couple pieces of legislation and a president that favors it. I mean, you're asking everybody in Washington who's built their whole careers on power and controlling the monetary policy to say, give up and go home.
And John, do you think Reagan would be a Bitcoiner?
Yeah, I do. Because he was always, I mean, think about this. Let's take technology on the what people used to call Star Wars. Yeah, STI. I mean, Ronald Reagan had visions of Golden Dome and everything that we're now spending money on 40 years ago. I mean, so he was a great outside the box thinker, and he was the one. He invested enormous amount of funds in modernizing the American military through technology, and so yeah, I do think he'd be a Bitcoiner. Remember, Paul Volcker was the head of the Federal Reserve under Reagan, and with the interest rates as high as it were, Reagan it kind of went like this. He's like,
Yeah, I think we bought a condo then, and interest was 17%, if I remember correctly, or something.
Yeah, those 20% rates, I want to put my dad out of business. The thing I loved about Reagan was he always, he was jolly and happy and positive, but he always understood, that government was the fundamental problem. You know what I mean? And he came out of that, Goldwater libertarian West Coast, view that, kind of we just, who needs a federal government? And to the degree we have one, let's rein it in as much as possible. With the exception of standing up to the Russians, which, one could argue that was actually that was a good use of federal government time and resources. So
yeah. In fact, you just almost stated the line exactly. That's the most famous line from Reagan's first inaugural address, which was "Government is the problem."
I can't remember. Is that exactly what he said? I thought so. Yeah. I thought it was something similar to that.
I think he said the scariest words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you."
Yeah. On the economic side with Reagan, as remarkably positive some of Trump's actions have been, I don't think he's still not done something that has been as big as defeat the entire Soviet Union, right? I mean, that changed the world forever, or at least hopefully forever. And the way he did it was, was it economic policy? Yeah, in a way it was, because what he essentially did was he looked at Gorbachev and he said, we have economic might, we're going to use it, and we're going to build, a defense system like you've never seen. And that was the moment when the Soviets just said, we can't afford this. We give up. That's essentially the play. But it did cost some money. We had to rebuild American defenses to make it happen.
When Russia was invading Afghanistan, back during that time period, I guess, basically, I always felt like Soviets. Yeah, Soviets. I always felt like that the end was coming for them soon because they were overexpanded, that it would be impossible to keep up with what was going on financially and stuff. Do you ever feel like the United States is in that situation right now, that we are overexpanded?
Carbon copy. Yep. Well, at least during the, roughly the last 10, 12 years, the whole Iraq, Afghanistan foray. I mean, what we should have done is, we should have gotten a lot of bombers, and over a 10-year period, just struck one time after another from the air and killed whatever we saw moving that looked anything like Osama bin Laden. But we sure as hell should not have put boots on the ground in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I mean, a complete waste of time and money. And we were just way overextended on that front. And it probably added a couple $1 trillion to our national debt. So now military strategists would say, well, you can't beat those guys unless you have boots on the ground. And I think our posture should, but we're not looking at beating, we're looking at punishing them.
Do you look, John, at the way that Trump is handling Venezuela, which, hitting the drug boats, seizing the tankers, obviously kidnapping Maduro as a more economically efficient way of trying to achieve something similar?
Yeah, well, Venice first, and there'll be a lot of people I know don't agree with me, but I support every single decision he's made with respect to Venezuela. And, for lots of reasons, but it's a big national security umbrella. I mean, they are the greatest transit point from which drugs in South America, Central South America flow. It kills a lot of people. That's one good reason alone. The second is they ripped us off. We used to have oil companies down there making money hand over fist, and they took that away from us. But third, I think people don't really fully understand to the extent that China and Russia and Iran were making the country of Venezuela a platform from which to continue to screw with our national security.
That's But that's the part that I observed. It reminded me, it was like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, this is a country in our hemisphere that's very close by, and we've got these three-state actors that we really don't like, taking over. And some people say Trump struck Venezuela. I think he did. I actually think more. I think the CIA actually made the call, or the Department of Defense.
Remember, Trump came right out and said, "Yeah, well, we're sending the CIA in there." I mean, he was, very bored about it, and he was right.
Well, but we went and kidnapped the president of Panama, and I don't remember this much action or negativity toward capturing him, and he didn't do near as much as we were seeing from Maduro.
Listen, we're either going to act like the superpower we are or we're not, and if our interests are being threatened, we have to act. And I think Trump understands that. He actually does what he says. I think now, Trump can shoot from the hip rhetorically, but I think the world now understands that when he says something just like Reagan, he really means it. And that's good. I think that's good to keep people on their toes in that regard.
John, I'm curious, one of the, if I can shift just a tiny bit, one of the reasons we do this show, and it's called the Bitcoin Boomers, is Gary, Larry, and we're within the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin cohorts. We're kind of the elders to a certain degree, and there's a couple others, but there frankly aren't many, at least that are prominent and vocal. And part of what we're here for is to try to get our generation that we share with you a little more involved, a little more engaged. And it's hard because Bitcoin is a strange thing. It's not like a startup company. We're not like AI. There's no company like OpenAI or Grok or Google out championing it. There is no leader. There's no central authority. And what it often means, I think, is that the proper narrative certainly doesn't get to people. And in fact, the opposite's true, that we've certainly come to find that over the last decade or so that the three of us have been involved, that if we look at major media outlets, whether that's CNN or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they've been adversarial. And so I think one thing that I would be curious about is, especially given, your extensive background, the fact that you keep current with world events, how do you perceive Bitcoin, and what kind of things out there make you question it, or the things that are unclear to you, like kind of how do you?
And in your peer group, I mean, the people you hang out with,
Yeah.
You seem to kind of get it, but do you find that to be the case for your peers or not?
Yeah, I have a good buddy who's a home builder, or he tries to be a home builder here in California, which is not easy. He's told me this story a few times about this friend of his at the time was a billionaire who made his wealth in the gaming industry, and this was how many years ago? I guess it's when $10,000 would buy a lot of Bitcoin. So you guys tell me how many years ago that was.
Probably 15, 12 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And this guy went to my buddy, the home builder, who was fairly well off, but he was in some struggle because there was some issues with permitting and that kind of things. So the guy said to him, "Look, just give me $10,000. You ought to bet on this thing called Bitcoin." My friend Brian's like, "What? What's that?" He said, "No, just $10,000. I'm telling you, you're going to make a." And Brian said, "No. I don't have the excess cash at this point." And so to this day, he's saying, "How many $1 billion would I be worth if I had done that?" So there's, in my peer group there, I'll tell you how my peers feel. They probably feel like me. We missed the boat, goddammit. It was like, if you brought it to me today, I'd be in. But man, it's like it's too late. Everybody got in early. They've done wonderfully, and no matter when they pass, they will have done wonderfully. Good for them, and good for them. It's just that it's like the train that left the state. It's almost like, Bob, it's like if you weren't into building AI 10, 12 years ago, you're way behind the curve now. Or if you weren't into pick an industry in the tech sector, and if you didn't get in early, you're never really be a winner.
Oh, your PC clone company in 2010, you were too late, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not as though they wouldn't like a lot of it if they could get their hands on it at some reasonable price. And I know that will be the topic will be what's reasonable, but I missed the train.
It's sad that it's a price bias. I mean, just to draw a comparison to that, I think Amazon is probably the best performing, one of the best performing stocks, other than Nvidia, which was just going nuts. But it's comparable to Bitcoin is Amazon, because it came out, before the GFC in early 2000, when the internet got started, and it's up 288,000% from the time when it came. And I recall a lot of people, in the 2008 period, the 2010 period, 15 period, all saying, "Oh gosh, yeah, I wish I'd gotten in on that, but you guys have made a ton of money, but you're too late." Well, it just kind of kept going.
But the people who bought at $100 said the same thing, because they said, I could have got this at a nickel. And the people who bought at $1,000 said the same thing.
Some of us got it for 10,000, some of us got it for a couple thousand or less, and someday, it's 100,000, just under 100,000 a day. I mean, in 10 years, 15 years, people say, you bought your Bitcoin for below $1 million, and yeah, I bought one
exactly.
for,
yeah,
and it's $1 million now. In fact, when I sign books at my book conference, when I go to the show, sign books, I always put the Bitcoin price in there and the date, because I want whoever receives the book, I know their kids will look at that book someday and say, "Hey, Mom or Dad met the guy who wrote this thing. Gosh, when they got this book, it was only $70,000. People feel like it's too late, but we're not,
Well, I was just going to say, maybe 5% of the peers I know have been wise enough to figure out a way to make it at least some percentage of their portfolio, right? Because they're like, I'm not going to miss out on this, and they can afford to be that diversified, and they'll treat Bitcoin just like they would treat gold, But I would say probably the impediment to boomers like myself and others in my peer group is that you're just so damn busy. For me, I'd be thinking, okay, if it's at 90,000 today or something, I think in these big round terms, like I need to get one Bitcoin, right? I know, but it's like a lack of sophistication and understanding how you can get in without having to buy one big solid coin.
There's a price buy. It's one of the reasons some of the other cryptos exist. Like, we are all Bitcoin purists. Like, we would say, don't mess with any of the other shit. It's all tainted. But it attracts other people because it might be $3 or $12 or $20. Because we live in a cocoon, John, or in our own echo chamber. It's valuable to hear from other people because it helps us kind of prioritize how we talk about it. And I think one of the things I'll offer just a little bit more to what Gary and Larry have said relative to the "you're too late." The first thing is to understand that there's only 21 million Bitcoin. And, remember when you just said it, like, hey, if I could only get one, like, which would be a little under $100,000 right now. Well, if there's 4 times more millionaires in the world than there are Bitcoin in the world. So it's almost, and we're at a point where, and that scarcity can't change. Like, so it's different than anything else, whether it's a stock or whether it's gold or anything else. We've never had an asset in the world, other than maybe a Monet painting or a collectible item, where a true commodity had a fixed supply. And you could think of it as we're competing against, remember what I said before, what man should work for what another man can print. There is no limit on the money printer. So as that printer keeps rolling, and you've even said it yourself, like we're headed toward a revolution, and whether that's a violent revolution or an economic catastrophe, but some combination of the two, it is a separation from that. So the way, and Larry wrote a great book on this, but we view it as there is no limit. And even if we wanted to put it into current terms, there's about $90 trillion of assets in the world today. There's only 21 million Bitcoin.
Abundant Minds is an Oregon-based husband and wife-owned Bitcoin mining company making Bitcoin mining accessible to investors of all ages and experience levels. Their fully managed white glove service allows you to own all of your own equipment and earn steady Bitcoin-denominated income without lifting a finger. Whether you're starting with 10,000 or 10 million, Abundant Minds is your one-stop shop. No overseas call center, no surprise upcharges. With one-on-one onboarding, consulting, and help navigating both Bitcoin and the Bitcoin mining space at every turn, you can rest easy while Bitcoin flows to you 24/7. Learn more at abundantminds.com.
Bitcoin Well is the best place to be buying and selling Bitcoin in Canada and the US. And now with Bitcoin Well Infinite, it's also the best place to be making large buys at their OTC desk of over $50,000. Their white glove service gives you fast transactions, no slippage, and the lowest fees. You can scan the QR code on the screen or simply head to bitcoinwell.com/BTC sessions to sign up today. And you can share your own personalized referral link to earn commissions. When I first got into Bitcoin, I was overwhelmed. The jargon, the security risks, the fear that one mistake could cost everything. I remember staring at my screen and wondering, are my keys safe? Did I do this right? That experience is why I started BTC Sessions. For over a decade, this channel has helped millions of people like you learn how to use and secure Bitcoin. But I realized something. For many people, videos aren't enough. Everyone learns differently. Some need to ask questions in real time as an expert walks through their setup, their goals, and their threat model. And certain things like advanced cold storage, inheritance planning, privacy, and node or mining setups often can't be fully solved by watching another tutorial. So I built BTC Mentor. I recruited the best Bitcoin educators on the planet to work with you one-on-one. Real experts, real answers, personalized hands-on guidance tailored to your exact situation. Whether you're brand new or building a complex setup, we meet you where you're at and walk with you step by step. By the end, you don't just hope your Bitcoin is safe, you know it is. If you're ready for that level of confidence, then head to btcmentor.io and book a call with us today.
You remember Metcalfe's law, John, by chance from your computer days? So it's, for those that don't know, it's the power of a network is equal to the square of the number of users of the network. So it's a term, and whether that's cell phones, whether that's personal computers, whether that's whatever, but it applies to monetary systems too. So as adoption of Bitcoin increases, the value of the network increases, its usability increases. And we're at a point in the adoption of Bitcoin as a monetary network where it already moves more value annually than Visa and Mastercard combined. So very few people will probably understand that's how much movement of money, and it's doing so in a frictionless way. There's no approvers right now, at least. Those are very inexpensive transactions. I could, if I had $1 billion, I could send you $1 billion, John, for about $2, and I could do it in 10 minutes. The existing monetary system cannot compete with that. And if you think about it, we kind of even back up a little geopolitically, and you think about that, what does that mean for a nation state? So like Russia, which when Russia invaded the Ukraine, one of Biden's first actions, I think it was a mistake, was to kick them off of the SWIFT system. And the reality is all it did is it forced them toward Bitcoin. The Russians now, their foreign trade minister openly admits that that is a major part of how they do international commerce now, is, you know, selling oil and buying oranges using Bitcoin. So where I'm getting at is whether it's at the nation state level or the corporate level or the individual level, the removement of government or an overseer from the process is part of it. And we'll even use Reagan's words, right? You know, government is the problem. Well, let's get them the hell out of money, and the monetary system.
You see, knowing what little I do about where Bitcoin stands in the halls of Congress and halls of government, is, you know, I think Bitcoin is absolutely ultimately going to succeed as, you know, it's digital gold. It's an asset. The world will treat it that way. Washington will treat it that way. Now, I think the industry's in this interesting situation, whichever industry goes through, and that is it's looking for nods of approval and respect, and, you know, ultimately regulation that allows the system to grow and flourish. So the good news is it's well on its way towards getting the necessary regulatory framework to thrive. It's just one of those be careful what you wish for things, right? Because, you know, in a regulatory framework, you're inviting all sorts of mischief, you know, and will the industry be happy with how Washington treats it purely from an asset perspective? How do you tax it? You know, all that stuff. Where the Mount Everest that I see is when the Bitcoin wants to move, as it wants to go from an asset, digital asset, to becoming the money supply. You know, that's a big term, and that is because it forces every single player in the current system to cede their power, right? And so how do you bring that about? That's really, I mean, because you may have lots of very conservative fiscal restraint Republicans that would say, yeah, we really ought to move to a system that's highly efficient, that doesn't involve the government and the rest of that. But in saying and doing that, they are giving up, they are ceding power to another, right? And why do you get elected? To gain power and to use power, right? So that's why I always feel like on its way to becoming truly the money supply or the monetary system, it has to achieve something that, I don't know, that any civilization in history has ever achieved at this level, you know, and that's going to be difficult.
Yeah, I think our view, the way we're going to get there, John, that you're right, they're never going to give it up voluntarily, just like they're never going to enact term limits. And rather sadly, because it's going to be a painful episode when it happens, but rather sadly, what's going to happen is the currency is going to fail. You know, we're going to have a hyperinflation event, and at that point in time, you know, there'll be a brief period where there's a little bit of chaos, and then we'll say, okay, what kind of money can we trust? And the only choices are going to be gold, silver, and Bitcoin.
If the United States currency fails, that means the world's currency fails.
That's correct.
Right? I mean, everybody's so tethered to it.
Right.
Right. And so that's why I've always, people will say, you know, well, this country's so divided, right and left, where, you know, everybody's gone to their distinct corners. There's no middle anymore. How do we get Americans to rally with each other and unite? It's like, yeah, well, what history has proven is you need some absolutely tremendous calamity, like a World War II or Pearl Harbor, or something. That's what it takes to get people's frameworks completely altered, to change. Yeah, and if that's what needs to happen to our monetary system, it's not going to be pretty. And I don't know for how long, you know, but I know that'll be an earth-shaking event, like something we've never seen before.
Hey, John, if I could go back a second to your statement that you were kind of like thinking you needed one Bitcoin, a whole Bitcoin. I just want to put this out there. From what I understand, to be in the top 1% of people that own Bitcoin, you only need a fourth of a Bitcoin. So you really don't need a lot of Bitcoin to have a lot of Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. And, after having this conversation, see, one of the other, probably the worst thing that happened to me in my labor at Gateway was, like many other corporations, Gateway offered me, well, you're in the C-suite now, so we're going to, free of charge, provide you with a financial advisor. And of course, here comes Goldman, right? Because I was so busy, doing whatever I was supposed to be doing in my work life, I said, okay, I'll outsource all my financial advice and thinking and decisions to this thing called Goldman. To this day, all my everything is tied up in Goldman manages it. Well, it made me stupid, basically, right? I mean, how much do you think about economics when there's some paid person who's thinking about economics for you, And and Goldman as an institution, I know, has been down on Bitcoin for quite some time. They're not the J.P. Morgans of the world, and but this conversation is going to lead me to start asking some pretty tough questions of my financial advisor as to why I don't have Bitcoin as part of my diversified mix.
I love that, John, because I think that's what you go to your friend, right? So your friend, we'll call it a decade or so ago, had, even as a billionaire, putting $10,000 in Bitcoin at that period would have been life-changing. Had Bitcoin gone to zero, it wouldn't have changed his life at all. So I think, I write a monthly newsletter now for Financial Advisor magazine. It goes to 400,000 wealth and financial advisors. And that's part of what I've been telling them for several years now, is I say, hey, you're going to have to be accountable to the people who years ago said to you, what about Bitcoin? And you said, no, it's too risky, it's speculative, it's a Ponzi, whatever it is. Well, it's not. It's roughly the sixth most valuable asset in the world. It's roughly on par with Amazon right now. And you told them for all these years to stay away. And now you have a difficult situation, because what's happening is a lot of them are pivoting. Morgan Stanley and, Fidelity, and even like Vanguard has now changed their tune. Like, how do you do that? How do you go to them and say, oh, now, like you said, I feel like I missed the boat. So you're going to go to them after they feel like they missed the boat and tell them now to get in? Like, it's very, very weird situation. And they were dead wrong. Obviously they were dead wrong, and they didn't do their work.
A lot of their own vested interests are all about keeping Bitcoin out.
Well, that's right. I mean, they make money from selling stocks, and so they're going to sell stuff. Yeah. So I've often said it's only a matter of time until somebody brings a class action lawsuit against these advisors and says, hey, this is the best performing financial asset the last 16 years. Why didn't I own any of it? That's your job, is to put me in these good assets. I'm going to sue you for malpractice. I mean, I don't know how much traction they'll get on that, but the point is that, people are being forced to reckon with it.
Yeah, I don't know, and you guys have probably thought about this, but I'm trying to understand is what parallels, if any, exist behind the evolution of AI and Bitcoin. And I just say that because, the world right now is half of it's on fire. Say, I can't wait for AI. Think of the productivity gains I'm going to get. Go, and who cares about the rules, whatever. And the other half is scared to death. I'm going to lose my job. This is going to be the end of the world. Robots will run the world. And it's like, okay, well, the truth is somewhere in between. But it's an accelerated situation. The situation is just accelerating. These AI advances are upon us quicker than we even know. And I'm wondering, it just makes sense to me that from a monetary standpoint, I'm not surprised that the digital economy is going to just move along with AI. And that's going to be a lot of wind at its back, I think. I'd be interested in your viewpoint on that.
I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, that's probably a whole episode in and of itself, John. But I'll say a couple things. One, as it pertains to AI, I think AI is going to need a currency, and the logical currency of AI is Bitcoin. So I think there will be a correlation as this thing matures. And in fact, there's interesting examples. If you look at let's say a Tesla car, and instead of thinking of the car as owned by somebody, you think of the car itself as a entity which wants to preserve itself. I'll use this as an example. Well, it can drive off literally out of the factory and start earning money. It can start giving rides, and it can collect and know that it has that it can collect Bitcoin and know that it's getting it. And it knows when it needs a recharge. It knows when it needs new brakes. And it has a currency by which it can sustain itself. And so I think that's an easy example for people to get, but it could be a robot. It could be even a completely virtual agent that now has a mechanism by which it can do. It's kind of scary shit, but it's wild, to think about. I think it will happen way faster, even though all of us are in the back nine of life. I think we will see this in our lifetime. And probably even within the decade, we'll see these sorts of things fulfill themselves. I think, interestingly, John, we came through an industry, the personal computer industry, and we look at the way it changed the world, the way adoption occurred, the way it changed labor, and like all those sort of. And I think, that was a foreshadow. This will be a bigger impact, but what happened. I think you entered in the mid 90s, right? I think that's when you came to Gateway. So you came in and we started working together almost at the a key inflection point, I would say. You entered there. I happened to start about 15 years before that. And we went through the classic curve of the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority. I think you came right as we were leaving the early majority and kind of entering the mainstream. And that next 6-7 years, when we worked together at Gateway, were kind of that was the real glory day, like of that. And that's where the world changed, because prior to that, we didn't have broadband. There really was no internet. People were largely using their personal computer to do things like word processing and spreadsheets. They maybe had an email account, but it was through AOL. It was a very different kind of world. And what happened over the next 7-8 years is, it changed everything, right? We went from one PC maybe in each house or each classroom to every student has one. Every desk in every business has one. Everybody has their own laptop. We saw administrative jobs collapse, right? Clerical jobs, administrative jobs, completely collapsed. All those sort of things. But AI is leaps and bounds beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's you really put it well, Bob. It's almost like AI needs a monetary system that can keep up with it. That's what it seems like. That'll be wind at its back.
You mentioned like you're not really been active. You're letting Goldman kind of, at a personal level. But do you view organizations, we'll use the Reagan Foundation, which I know you are no longer active, when they look at managing their endowment or their trust, I'm not quite sure what structure you guys have. How do you see them looking at something like Bitcoin? And you're part of the, so the Waite Family Foundation and philanthropic, endeavors. How do you see them looking at it?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I started at the Reagan Foundation, I was stunned that its endowment was only like 30 million, and that, that number. I mean, that would be enough to pay for 3/4 of a year of operations. I mean, it was just way too small. So we went on a huge development spree, and by the time I left, we had 350 million in the endowment. And and interestingly enough, Goldman Goldman manages that money too. And the thing about Bitcoin and let's say the nonprofit world, which Reagan Foundation would be, so the entire nonprofit sector has a more conservative dial on their investment strategy than you would if you were a business or in private enterprise, right? Because you've got donors, not customers, and you have to watch every dollar like a hawk if you want to stay tax exempt and grow. So I would say, like while any company, Microsoft or others, have this piece of Bitcoin in their investment portfolio, the harder nut to crack will be the major endowments, whether Harvard or the Reagan Foundation, what have you, because they're just naturally like, oh man, if it's an asset that goes up and down and way too much, they'll stay away. I think it'll take some stability and more broader acceptance, and it will reach the point where smart endowments in the nonprofit space will invest and will get involved. But I think at least at this point, it's probably, further out on the horizon.
Well, yeah, we're going to kind of move off of Bitcoin because I think maybe we'll close with this. I mentioned John is one of the most interesting people in the world. And after, I guess it was simultaneous with running the Reagan Library, John authored a couple books, at least the first one, right, John? The first one you completed at least while you were there. Did you do the second one too? The second one. Yeah. And I had the pleasure of going to the Reagan Library where we had the unveiling, John. I don't know what you would call that, where you unveiled the book. But the first book was called The Shroud Conspiracy. And it's a book I've read The Shroud Conspiracy and the sequel to The Shroud Conspiracy, both a couple times. They're phenomenal books. I guess you wouldn't call it historical fiction, John. What would you call it? Maybe
if you're familiar with the Da Vinci Code and that style of it's a scientific religious thriller.
And this one, as you can probably guess from the title, involves the Shroud of Turin, and so I think, John, maybe just kind of why did you write that book, and what I'm also interested in your perspectives on the Shroud itself.
Well, I just bought the book, John.
Thank you. Both became bestsellers, which was kind of nice and somewhat of a fluke because I had never written novels before. But the idea for this series is built on when I was 17 years old. I sat there, I'm Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school, and we sat in this religion class one day, and they showed this film by the Catholic Church, which is about the Shroud of Turin. And when you see the shroud and you look at the image that's on that famous cloth and you stare at it and you're like you've been raised, always kind of wonder, well, what does Jesus Christ, what did he actually look like? And you look at the shroud, it's kind of stunning.
Have you seen it in person?
Yes, I have. Yeah. Now, it's not on display in the public very often because the church is hugely careful about lighting and as an artifact, especially that old, you have to be extremely careful about exposing it to radiation, outside light, ultraviolet, all that. So it put the idea in my head that this is a story that could be very fascinating to write about. And 35 years later, it's still on my mind. I went, Bob Wood knows this fellow very well, Ted Waite, who I worked for. After Gateway, I ran the Waite Institute. One of our projects was, let's go find the lost airplane of Amelia Earhart. So I went down in the South Pacific for 2 months aboard some really big ships trying to find her aircraft, based on formulas that would determine where she probably entered and crashed and the rest of that. But anyways, when you are vacuuming the ocean floor for 2 months, there's a lot of things that are, you have a lot of time on your hands. And so it was on that trip that I developed the plot for the book. But I didn't write it right away. I waited till I was at the Reagan Library and I had some time. And so at nighttime, I just, for 6 months straight, every night I went and wrote this book. And it's about a historical anthropologist who is an atheist. To him, God's an absurd concept. And he's made a career and made a lot of money proving religious relics as fakes around the world. And he does it using science and a great team of scientists. They're able to prove through carbon dating and any number of other means what's real and what's not. And so I thought, well, why don't I put that to the test? I took this guy as the character who was asked by the Catholic Church to prove or disprove the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And it's the book is kind of fascinating because it's not just a scientific whodunit, but it's a journey. It's not just a journey around the world. It's a journey of internally what happens to him when he discovers through scientific means that the Shroud is real. It is authentic. Because you can imagine as an atheist, that throws his world into a total tailspin. Because now he has to believe that there really is this thing called faith really has something behind it. And so the book's kind of a love story and a science story and a religious story. And it ends up getting very out there because in this plot, this group of individuals wants to steal a speck of blood from the Shroud in order to recombine the DNA and create a second coming of their own through cloning of Jesus Christ. And so it's a big tale, and fortunately it sold really well. Hopefully, one of the things I'm spending in my lonely retirement is trying to figure out if I can get the books converted into a full-length feature film. And I'm making some progress. We'll see if it goes where it goes from here.
I will say this, and I appreciate you sharing this, John. I think to try to bring it back to Bitcoin, I think what is interesting and I encourage everybody to get the book, read the book, and if you're a Bitcoiner, think about the protagonist, Bondurant. Was it right? John Bondurant. Do I remember it right? He's an atheist and he becomes a believer. And I think there's an analogy to Bitcoin too, that there's a whole bunch of people out there that are non-believers and part of what we're doing is, we're converting them much like, through the truth, right? Through the truth, what is money? And John, we view this, the three of us, I'm speaking for the three of us, it's very much a good versus evil battle that we think, money and the abuse of the monetary system creates a great deal of, and maybe even almost all of the problems of the world. And if we have a truthful form of money, we have a society that has a chance.
Yeah, really. I mean, that's interesting. I think you're right. You're absolutely right. Another quick side story. As I didn't, in the plot of this book, one of the antagonists comes to find he has pancreatic cancer, and he's given just a few months to live. And I remember at the time as I was researching what are the 5 worst cancers you can get, pancreatic was like right at the top of the list. And I didn't know at the time, but as I was writing, I too had terminal cancer. And I was on the list of 5. I decided to finish the series before I passed. I was given 3 months to live. And boy, did that ever put me into a faith tunnel. But at the end of the day, here I sit, having given less than 1% chance to live. just like the character in my book, who was also given a second life, but through very bad means. I'll just say that. So it's interesting how this world spins around sometimes. By the way, the way I survived, I ended up, I was asked this question when I launched the book, because a lot of people know about that story, especially those close to me. And I underwent 5 years of experimental treatments. And finally, it was this combination of brand new immunotherapy drugs that I took. But interestingly enough, after the first immunotherapy treatment, I also got on a plane and I flew to Lourdes in France, where, especially if you're a person of faith, in the Catholic faith, it's the site of a miracle. So I immersed myself in the springs of Lourdes. And when I came back 6 weeks later, for the first time in 5 years, my scan showed it was clean. Now, people say, well, what did it? Was this miraculous spring, or was it the immunotherapy? And I say, I don't know. Maybe it was a combination of both.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for sharing that, John. Obviously, as your friend and somebody I respect tremendously, I'm so happy you're here. Like, it is a blessing. I've sent plenty of prayers for you back in those days, and you had a bunch of prayer warriors fighting for you at that time. But what a wonderful story. And John, I'm so happy that we got to do this. I think we talked about it probably a year ago, doing something like this, but we finally pulled it off, and I think people are going to love this. I really, really enjoyed spending this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I did. I learned a lot, and that's the next call I'm going to make is to Goldman Sachs.
Well,
Yeah.
When you get our books, you'll have some ammunition. You'll say, hey, you got to read this book. This will explain why.
I will. I tell you what, if you send me those books, I'll send you some copies of mine. How's that?
Sounds like a deal.
Like a deal to me too.
Hey, you. Yes, you watching the Bitcoin price movements and the latest exciting news. It's awesome to stay informed, but the real power of Bitcoin comes from taking control. Don't just watch, take action. Head over to btcsessions.ca/learn for free step-by-step tutorials that guide you through every major skill you need to know, plus full video playlists for deeper dives on any topic you like. And if you're ready for the ultimate fast track, scroll to the bottom and check out bitcoinmentor.io for premium one-on-one experience with my team of Bitcoin experts to ensure you get it right the first time. Don't wait. Secure your Bitcoin future today. Hit the link in the show notes or scan the QR code on the screen.